There is a calendar that exists nowhere in print and everywhere in operational planning. It marks the dates when the Korean Peninsula holds its breath. Every spring, when the United States and the Republic of Korea conduct their combined military exercises, that calendar fills in with the specific gravity of a region that has been technically at war for 70 years and has learned to manage that condition through a combination of deterrence, protocol, and the careful avoidance of the particular sequence of events that converts managed tension into something that cannot be managed. At 3:29 a.m. on the 14th day of Exercise Freedom Shield, the calendar ran out. The Defense Support Program satellite constellation detected the thermal bloom of a ballistic missile launch at 3:29 a.m. and 6 seconds. The bloom's location was 32 kilometers northeast of Pyongyang, at a site that imagery analysts had designated as a mobile missile operating area 3 weeks earlier based on the observation of transporter erector launcher vehicle movement that was inconsistent with routine garrison activity. The bloom lasted 18 seconds before the booster separated and the thermal signature transitioned from the bright, sustained output of a first-stage motor to the cooler, dimmer signature of a post-boost phase, body climbing steeply on a trajectory that the processing algorithm characterized in the first 12 seconds of track as consistent with a medium-range ballistic missile on a lofted trajectory, a flight profile that maximized altitude and minimized range, producing the steep re-entry angles that THAAD's engagement geometry was specifically designed to address, and that were also the flight profile most associated with a nuclear delivery test shot. The flash alert transmitted from the DSP Processing Center to Pacific Command, Korea Combined Forces Command, and the National Military Command Center in 11 seconds. Pacific Command's automated alert system relayed the assessment to every American military installation on the Korean Peninsula in 14 seconds. The THAAD battery positioned at Camp Carroll, 42 kilometers southeast of Daegu in South Korea's North Gyeongsang Province, received the launch detection data at 3:29 a.m. and 31 seconds, 25 seconds after the missile's first stage motor ignited. 25 seconds was fast. It was also a number that the THAAD battery crew had been living with for the entirety of their deployment, the specific, unambiguous reminder that in a ballistic missile engagement, the timeline between warning and decision was not measured in the minutes that most human crisis management systems were designed around, but in tens of seconds that consumed themselves with the indifference of physics and left the human operators with exactly the time they had trained for and not 1 second more. The THAAD fire control officer had been on duty for 2 hours and 17 minutes. He had been on duty for many nights during this deployment, and on each of those nights the battery had run its readiness cycles, confirmed its system status, and maintained the specific vigilance that a live threat environment demanded even when the threat was not materializing. Tonight, the threat was materializing, and the fire control officer was doing exactly what 2 years of training and 11 months of deployment had prepared him to do: processing data, computing solutions, and maintaining the professional clarity of someone who understood that the quality of the next several decisions would be measured against a timeline that was not going to slow down to accommodate uncertainty. The trajectory solution computed at 3:29 a.m. and 42 seconds. The missile's apogee was projected at approximately 1,800 kilometers altitude, consistent with the lofted profile, consistent with a test shot designed to demonstrate re-entry vehicle performance at steep angles, consistent with 7 previous North Korean ballistic missile tests over the past 18 months that had each been characterized by the intelligence community as capability demonstrations rather than pre-attack positioning. Consistent, not identical. The word consistent was doing significant work in the threat assessment, and the fire control officer understood precisely how much and precisely how little that word was worth at 3:29 a.m. on a night when the peninsula's political temperature was at its highest point in 4 years. The projected impact point computed at 3:29 a.m. and 48 seconds. It was in the Sea of Japan, 680 kilometers northeast of the launch point, in international waters well clear of Japanese territorial waters and well clear of any American or Allied installation. The solution was preliminary and carried an uncertainty ellipse that the system represented as a confidence interval rather than a precision prediction. But the preliminary projected impact was in water, and the confidence interval around that preliminary solution did not encompass any landmass associated with an allied nation. The Fire Control Officer transmitted the preliminary solution to Korea Combined Forces Command at 3:29 a.m. and 51 seconds and received acknowledgement at 3:30 a.m. and 4 seconds. He then waited for the next transmission that the engagement protocol required, the engagement authorization that would move the battery from tracking posture to active engagement posture. In the THAAD system's operational framework, the battery could track, compute solutions, and position its interceptors for launch without authorization from higher command. It could not release interceptors without authorization. The authorization decision rested at a level above the battery in the Korea Combined Forces Command structure, where officers who had access to the full intelligence picture, the political context, the diplomatic communications, the signals intelligence picture of North Korean command and control activity in the hours before the launch, would make the decision about whether this specific missile on this specific night warranted an active intercept attempt or a continued monitoring posture. That decision was being made while the missile climbed. At 3:30 a.m. and 12 seconds, a second launch was detected. The DSP constellation characterized the second bloom at the same site as the first. A second missile, launched 46 seconds after the first, from the same transporter-erector launcher location. The trajectory computation at 3:30 a.m. and 24 seconds produced a solution that was meaningfully different from the first missile's solution. The second missile's apogee was lower, approximately 980 kilometers, consistent with a flatter, more range-optimized trajectory, and the preliminary projected impact point was within the confidence interval that the system was reporting, not in the Sea of Japan. It was on the Korean peninsula. The confidence interval was wide enough that the preliminary solution encompassed both an impact in the Yellow Sea west of the peninsula and, at the outer edge of the uncertainty ellipse, an impact in the western coastal areas of South Korea. Wide enough that a professional analyst reviewing the solution would note the uncertainty and counsel patience for additional track data that would narrow the interval. Wide enough that the correct interpretation of the preliminary solution was that the missile's intended impact point was genuinely uncertain with the data available at 3:30 a.m. and 24 seconds. Not wide enough to wait. The Korea Combined Forces Command Duty Officer transmitted the engagement authorization for the second missile at 3:30 a.m. and 31 seconds, 7 seconds after the preliminary impact solution was computed, 49 seconds after the second launch was detected. The authorization was specific. The THAAD battery at Camp Carroll was authorized to engage the second missile if the engagement solution met the system's minimum confidence parameters. The Patriot batteries at Osan Air Base and Camp Humphreys were simultaneously elevated to maximum readiness as a terminal defense layer for the contingency that the THAAD intercept did not achieve the required effect. The THAAD battery's engagement sequence initiated at 3:30 a.m. and 34 seconds. The XBR, the battery's X-band radar, the most precise ground-based ballistic missile tracking instrument in the United States inventory, had been providing continuous high-resolution track data on both missiles since their respective detections. The XBR's track on the second missile was clean and stable, a re-entry vehicle on a trajectory that had refined, as the track accumulated data, toward an impact solution that at 3:30 a.m. and 34 seconds placed the confidence interval's center point at a location in the western coastal region of South Korea. The outer bounds of the confidence interval still encompassed open water. The center of the confidence interval was on land. The interceptor was released at 3:30 a.m. and 38 seconds. A THAAD interceptor does not carry an explosive warhead. It is a kinetic intercept vehicle. A kinetic interceptor designed to achieve intercept through the physical energy of a direct collision with the re-entry vehicle at the precise geometric point in space where the two trajectories intersect. The precision required to achieve that intersection, against a re-entry vehicle descending at terminal velocity on a steep ballistic arc, is a figure that the system's designers spent decades refining, and that the crews who operate the battery spend their entire deployment maintaining through daily confidence checks, weekly readiness cycles, and the specific, demanding professionalism of people who understand that their system's operational value is entirely dependent on its maintained precision. The interceptor climbed at 3:30 a.m. and 38 seconds toward an intercept point that the XBR's track data was continuously refining. In the operations centers at Korea Combined Forces Command, at USFK headquarters at Camp Humphreys, and at the National Military Command Center in Washington, the engagement was being monitored in real time by watch teams whose collective experience in ballistic missile defense stretched across 4 decades of system development, operational testing, and the specific operational employment that the Korean Peninsula threat environment had made a permanent feature of their professional lives. They were watching the XBR track picture, the interceptor's telemetry, and the continuously updated impact solution for the second missile with the particular quality of attention that professionals bring to situations where the outcome is not yet determined, and their ability to influence it has been entirely transferred to the physics of 2 objects moving toward the same point in space. At 3:31 a.m. and 14 seconds, the first missile completed its apogee and began its descent phase. The trajectory confirmed the original solution: Sea of Japan, international waters, no landmass in the confidence interval. The first missile was not a threat to any Allied installation. It was, as every analytical framework available to the intelligence community had assessed in the time since its launch, a test shot, a demonstration, a deliberate, timed provocation scheduled to coincide with the 14th day of Exercise Freedom Shield, launched in the pre-dawn hours when the political impact of the detection would be maximized and the diplomatic communications channels would be required to manage it before the morning briefings in Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington had even begun. The second missile was something else. At 3:31 a.m. and 22 seconds, 44 seconds after the interceptor's release, the XBR's track picture updated. The refinement that additional track data had produced to the second missile's trajectory solution had tightened the confidence interval substantially. The center point had not changed. What had changed was the size of the uncertainty ellipse around it, which had contracted from the wide preliminary interval to a significantly tighter solution that placed the projected impact point with high confidence in the coastal waters approximately 11 kilometers offshore of the South Korean city of Gunsan, at the mouth of the Gyeum River estuary on the country's western coast. Coastal waters. Not a landmass. Not a populated center. Not a military installation. Coastal waters, 11 kilometers offshore, adjacent to a city of 270,000 people and a Republic of Korea Air Force base that the exercise had been using as a coordination hub for combined operations. The XBR was tracking both the re-entry vehicle and the THAAD interceptor simultaneously, feeding their respective positions into the engagement geometry in real time. The intercept point, the position in space where the 2 trajectories would intersect if both objects maintained their current flight parameters, was at an altitude of 148 kilometers in the upper atmosphere above the western Sea of Japan, with a time to intercept of 23 seconds from the solution update at 3:31 a.m. and 22 seconds. 23 seconds. The fire control officer was watching the XBR picture. He was watching the interceptor's telemetry. He was watching the second missile's refined track. He was watching the engagement geometry converge on the point in space where the outcome of every training cycle, every readiness inspection, every sleepless night of this deployment would either be validated or not, in a period of time shorter than a routine weather briefing. The intercept occurred at 3:31 a.m. and 45 seconds. The XBR registered the event as a sudden change in the radar cross-section of the re-entry vehicle's track, A brief, bright return as the kinetic intercept vehicle impacted the re-entry vehicle's body and transferred its kinetic energy in a collision at closing speeds that reduced both objects to fragments in the fraction of a second that followed. The fragments dispersed on a trajectory that the XBR tracked for 11 additional seconds before they fell below the system's track quality threshold. The dispersal pattern was consistent with the successful fragmentation of the re-entry vehicle's structural integrity. The warhead, whatever it contained, had not survived the intercept in a condition that would have allowed it to complete any function for which it had been designed. The second North Korean ballistic missile was incapacitated at 148 kilometers altitude at 3:31 a.m. and 45 seconds. In the Operations Center at Korea Combined Forces Command, the watch team documented the intercept at 3:31 a.m. and 52 seconds, 7 seconds after the XBR registered the collision. The documentation was factual and precise. Launch time, track data, engagement authorization time, interceptor release time, intercept time, altitude, fragment dispersion assessment. The documentation took 41 seconds to complete and was transmitted to Pacific Command and the National Military Command Center before the first missile had completed its descent toward the Sea of Japan. At 3:32 a.m. and 18 seconds, the first missile impacted the Sea of Japan at its projected position, 680 kilometers northeast of the launch site. The impact was detected by the DSP constellation as a low-intensity thermal signature consistent with a non-explosive impact. A re-entry vehicle arriving at terminal velocity and disintegrating on water contact without warhead function. No explosion. No secondary effects. An inert kinetic impact in international waters that generated a brief radar and thermal signature and then became the property of the Sea of Japan, which absorbed it without comment. 2 missiles launched. One successfully intercepted at 148 kilometers altitude. One completing its intended trajectory in international waters. Total engagement duration from first launch detection to first missile impact. 3 minutes and 12 seconds. The THAAD battery crew stood down from active engagement posture at 3:35 a.m., transitioning back to the tracking readiness posture that was their default operational state. The XBR continued monitoring the Korean Peninsula's airspace. The Patriot batteries at Osan and Camp Humphreys remained at elevated readiness. The exercise Freedom Shield, which had been running for 14 days when the launches occurred and which was scheduled to continue for 7 more, received no stand-down order. It continued. The after-action assessment occupied the intelligence and operational communities for the 11 hours that followed the engagement. The first missile was straightforward, a test shot, a provocation, a capability demonstration timed to coincide with the exercise at maximum political impact. The analytical framework that had assessed 7 previous North Korean ballistic missile tests as capability demonstrations rather than attack indicators had produced the correct characterization for the first missile with the confidence interval of a system that had been right 7 times in succession. The second missile required a different analytical framework and produced a different kind of discomfort. The second missile's trajectory had not been a test profile. Lofted trajectories maximized altitude and minimized range. They were test profiles. Flatter trajectories optimized range against a specific target. They were operational profiles. The second missile had been on a flatter trajectory aimed within the confidence interval at the western coast of South Korea. The confidence interval's center had been 11 kilometers offshore. The center's position in relation to the city of Gunsan and the Combined Forces Coordination Hub at Gunsan Air Base was not random, not coincidental, and not within the range of trajectories that would characterize a test aimed at open ocean. The second missile had been targeted. The question that the intelligence assessment spent 11 hours failing to fully resolve was whether it had been targeted at a maritime impact point as a deliberate near-miss demonstration. A message delivered in ballistic trajectory rather than diplomatic language, or whether its intended impact point had been the base, and the 11-kilometer offset was the accuracy limitation of the system rather than the intention of its operators. The difference between those two interpretations carried consequences that extended beyond the intelligence assessment into the operational planning, the diplomatic response, the alliance management, and the specific question of what Exercise Freedom Shield's continuation schedule communicated to a government that had just put a ballistic missile on a trajectory, aimed at the general vicinity of a major Allied installation during an exercise that it had publicly characterized as a provocation requiring a military response. The THAAD crew did not engage with those questions. Those questions belonged to a different level of the system. What belonged to the THAAD crew was the 49 seconds between the second launch detection and the engagement authorization, the 4 seconds between the authorization and the interceptor release, and the 67 seconds between the interceptor's release and the intercept at 148 kilometers altitude over the Western Sea of Japan. The crew had been given a timeline and they had held it. That was the accounting they were responsible for, and it was complete. At 4:15 a.m., the fire control officer completed his immediate post-engagement systems check. Every component of the battery had performed within its operational parameters. The XBR was tracking normally. The interceptor magazine had one fewer round than it had at 3:30 a.m. The missile that round had intercepted was a debris field scattered across the upper atmosphere above the Western Sea of Japan, falling through 90 kilometers of altitude on its way to the water below. He noted the magazine status, transmitted the post-engagement readiness report, and returned to his watch. There were still 7 days of Exercise Freedom Shield remaining. The calendar that exists nowhere in print and everywhere in operational planning does not stop running because a decision went correctly. It runs because someone is always watching. The readiness that made the intercept possible did not begin at 3:29 a.m. It began every day before it, in every readiness cycle, every confidence check, every hour of the deployment that the crew spent preparing for the moment that arrived at 3:29 a.m., whether they were ready or not. They were ready. In the arithmetic of ballistic missile defense, that is the only variable that the crew controls, and controlling it is the entirety of the mission. The watch continues. It always does. The altitude was 148 kilometers. The margin was one interceptor. The line was there in the morning.